Hello, everybody, and today we're going to be focusing on the Enlightenment, which is the first topic of Unit 5, which is the first topic of our new time period, 1750 to 1900. So we start with the Enlightenment because it lays the foundation for everything that's about to happen. And when we look at the Enlightenment, what we want to do is just have a basic overview, basic understanding of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a movement that grows out of the scientific revolution of the 15 and 1600s. Now, we haven't spent a lot of time in this class talking about the scientific revolution, but we want to just sum this up really quickly. The scientific revolution was a movement in Europe that advanced this idea of empiricism. What that means is that I can understand the way the world works, the way nature works, by collecting information and by drawing conclusions from the data I've collected. So I can experiment and I can reason out from the results of my experimentations what actually happens in the world. And if you have a tough time wrapping your head around empiricism, just think of your science classes. What do you do with the lab? You do an experiment, you record the results, and then you provide some type of theory about how something works. So the empirical method is a method of deriving knowledge, of discovering truth through a systematic, data driven, observation driven process. And you might commonly call the empiricism the scientific method, even though there's a little bit more complex than that. But the empirical mindset is that I can break down the world and understand it like I would a machine. And that brings me to number two, the mechanical view of the world. Everything works in this world according to the principles of a machine. That's what the scientific revolution is going to advance. So really the trick is just understanding how the machine works. Once I understand how the machine works, I can manipulate the machine and I can use the machine to my advantage. So an example of this is the development of artillery during this time. Once people figured out how gravity affects objects that are accelerating at a particular speed, I can more accurately predict a projectile flying through the air and how much force it would require to travel a certain distance. This is a idea of mechanical views that I can break things down into their step by step process. And if I can copy it, I can produce the same effect. And if I manipulate it in the right way, I can have different outcomes. So, what this all leads to, and this is the most important thing, is that the scientific revolution argues that the world works, the natural world works according to natural laws. That this isn't God stepping in and just having his or her way or its way, whatever you want to say. It isn't God just stepping in and making things happen. Rather, there's a order to the universe. And the scientific revolution is premised on the idea that things have an order to them, that they work according to laws. And we can understand and learn these laws through an empirical approach. Now, you've got that scientific mindset going on, and that's going to impact the Enlightenment mindset because all the Enlightenment does is say, just like the natural world works according to natural laws, so do human beings. Human beings behave according to natural laws. And we're going to get more into that. But that right there, the natural laws, that's what you want to star and you want to underline. That human behavior, religion, politics, gender relations, economics, they all work according to natural laws. That's what the Enlightenment is going to advance. And when you look at it this way, all the Enlightenment is applying the same approach that the scientists of the scientific revolution used to human behavior. So we're going to be talking more about that, but that's the big underlying message. So the second thing is the impact that printed material played on the spread of the Enlightenment. So one of the things that we really didn't talk about is that in 1453 there's an invention called the printing press. It's Based out of Europe, it's based on Chinese technologies from earlier periods, but the printing press, made in 1453, is instrumental in spreading new ideas across Europe. When Columbus comes back and writes of his discoveries in the New World, it's the printing press that publicizes his voyages. When Marco Polo comes back from China, later it's the printing press that tells everybody about it. When the scientific revolution is taking place and a mathematician named Copernicus speculates that maybe it's the sun that's in the center of the universe, is the printing press that produces his books. When Luther argues that the Catholic Church is in the wrong when it comes to religious theology, is the printing press that spreads the ideas of the Reformation out. So the printing press is a transformational technology because it allows new ideas to spread much more rapidly. And in a way, and if you don't mind a little bit of a tangent, in a way, this is still going on. The printing press is invented, and you have this great disruption in Europe called the Reformation. Later, we have radio invented, and you have this great disruption called World War II. And then you have television, and television is going to bring about, you think about it, the late 60s, early 70s, the social disruption of protests against the Vietnam War, civil rights movements. Those are going to be strengthened by television projecting images across America. And today, of course, we have social media. So it seems that whenever human beings come up with a new way to rapidly communicate, we always find ourselves in a period of challenges. Just something for you to think about. By the Enlightenment, newspapers and pamphlets have become extremely popular. So newspapers and pamphlets had the advantage of being an everyday thing that most readers could consume of all different classes. You didn't have to have high level of education to read newspapers and pamphlets. So now we have this growing number of people in society that are being informed about new ideas and events that are going on. Books are also going to become much more popular in the 18th century. And what I mean by popular, I mean more available. So the printing press is allowing more people access to books. And you have to understand in the 18th century, books would have still been expensive. So the books only go to the upper and the wealthy middle class. But the books have these new Enlightenment ideas. So this new group of people are getting these ideas. The point here is that printed material is increasing during the 1700s, during this time of the Enlightenment. And as a result, the ideas of the Enlightenment can more easily spread. Letter C is one that I want you to star and I want you to know: challenging tradition. One of the big things about the Enlightenment, and this is going to be a theme as I go through this lecture, is that it challenged traditional institutions of society. And I'm not going to say much more because we're going to be coming back to that a lot in the next few slides. Letter D, the impact on world history is significant because while these Enlightenment ideas are becoming the foundation for European philosophy, Europe is also undergoing an industrial revolution that is going to transform it and allow it to become a powerhouse globally. If you remember in 1450 to 1750, Europe is starting to engage in global trade, but they're not dominating it. They're not dominating it because technologically they're equal to the Chinas and the Mughal empires and the Tokugawa shogunate. They don't necessarily have that technological edge that allows them to dominate. The Industrial Revolution gives them that edge. And as Europe spreads itself and begins to politically and economically dominate throughout the world, those Enlightenment ideas go with them. And the Enlightenment ideas are going to come into different parts of the world and transform those parts of the world in many different ways. And that's what we'll be talking about in this unit. Last thing is that the Enlightenment is based on observation and logic, or what we might call rationalism. So, what the Enlightenment writers or the Enlightenment philosophers did was they would write about how human behavior worked. And they would base their conclusions on observation of behavior and logic. And this is exactly how the scientific revolution underwent. The scientific revolution worked on the same premises. So now you have the Enlightenment philosophers fancying themselves, if you will, as social scientists. And then, in a way, that's where we're starting to get to that term. They see a scientific approach to understanding human behavior. And that's the big thing you want to keep in mind when you connect the two. So now what we want to do is we want to transition to more details. And what I'm going to do is just go through five different categories. First, we'll start with political aspects. Now, the political aspects are going to challenge the tradition of absolutism and divine right. And this is a significant development because up to this point, the idea of having a strong central leader who is above everybody else was an accepted concept throughout the history of civilization when you really think about it. We've talked about divine right and we talked about absolutism. But what's happening with the Enlightenment is that they challenge the foundational beliefs of where power is focused in a society. And we start this with a philosopher named Thomas Hobbes. So now we're on to letter B. And what Thomas Hobbes argued was that society is based on what we call a social contract. So I want you to associate Hobbes with social contract. And what Hobbes said was that by nature, human beings are competitive. Human beings are always going to do what's in their best interest, regardless of other people's interests. So Hobbes had a very dim view on human beings. He believed that human beings were always going to go out and do what was best for them, not necessarily what was best for everyone. And what happens is that Hobbes said that human beings can't live like this. Human beings would fall into war. We would be constantly fighting with each other because we're always trying to get our own. We're trying to get what's best for us, which puts me into competition, which will lead to conflict. So Thomas Hobbes said you can't have civilization if man is acting natural. You have to have government for civilization to happen. So what happened, according to Hobbes, is that human beings came together and they agreed to form a government. And they gave that government power and they gave up freedom, the freedom to do whatever they want. Because if they do whatever they want, they'll end up killing each other. That's basically what Hobbes is driving at. So they create this powerful government to provide security and safety. And now human beings can start doing things without worrying about being attacked. Now they can engage in trade. Now they can engage in businesses. Now they can engage in art, and civilization begins to grow. So, to Thomas Hobbes, you needed to have a strong government. You needed to have a strong absolutist government. Now, if you're going, but wait a second, you just said that the political movement is against that tradition, and you're right. What Hobbes is saying, though, is that the absolutist king does not get their power from God. Rather, the absolutist king gets their power from a social contract, from a deal that has been made with the people. The government will provide order and safety, and the people will provide obedience. And once you make that contract, it can't be broken, according to Hobbes. Now, later, a guy named John Locke comes along. And John Locke is going to take the social contract theory and he's going to agree to it, but he's also going to alter it a bit. So, what Locke says is that yes, we come together, we form governments so we can have order and security in order for us to be able to be free. But what he said was that you don't give up your rights to the government. Okay. What you do is you consent to be governed. So, what I'm doing is I'm agreeing to let this government rule over me. However, I still retain natural rights. And that's number one. Number one, this concept of natural rights. What John Locke was saying is that we by nature have rights, we have freedoms. And the government is not there to take those rights away from us. That's what Thomas Hobbes said. John Locke is saying the government is there to protect those rights, to preserve our natural rights. And there's three natural rights that John Locke emphasized. life, liberty, and the ownership of property. I'm sure you were thinking pursuit of happiness, but you're close. Life, liberty, and the ownership of property. Those are natural rights that every human being has. So we create government to protect those rights. That's the role of the government. The government's not there to tell us what to do. The government's there to ensure that we have safety, but also to ensure that our rights are protected from one another. And in that way, we continue to be free. Now, this is something else to put with the role of the government. If the government fails to do their job, John Locke said we have the right to change that government. So, one of the things that John Locke really emphasized was we can change the government if the government fails to do its job. So, that's where we can withdraw our consent, is basically what John Locke was saying. So, if you've ever read the Declaration of Independence closely, it has John Locke's philosophy all over the place. John Locke's philosophy is all over the Declaration of Independence. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. A third person that we want to bring up is a guy named Montesquieu, where he talked about the separation of powers. So, Montesquieu, he says that human beings are competitive. He's very much like Thomas Hobbes. And he said if you give one human being all the power, they will become a tyrant. They will destroy people's freedoms and destroy people's rights. Montesquieu said the trick is to separate the powers of government, to create one group that will make the laws, one group that will execute the laws, one group to interpret the laws. And if that sounds familiar, that's because you remember NSL. The separation of powers is the basis of our constitutional system. We have a president, we have a Congress, we have a court system, and they have separate powers that check each other. And the idea is that no one person will be able to collect all the power. Because if one person collects the power, then they can destroy our liberty. So that's Montesquieu's argument about government. He says, look, people are by nature competitive. They by nature are going to take as much power as they can get and do what's in their best interest. So therefore, split the power up. Don't give anybody the power. Now, this is a strong argument against absolutism. Okay. Instead of putting all the power into the king, break the power up amongst different people. And that way, everybody has liberty. And then our last one gets a little confusing. So I'm going to try and simplify this. There's a philosopher named Jean Jacques Rousseau, and he puts out the idea of the general will. So the general will is that society should be governed by the will of the people. And the government should be a reflection of the will of the people. So this becomes a lot more democratic. This becomes, this is definitely rejecting absolutism, but it puts the power more and more into the everyday person. Where Locke says you give power to an elite group, and that elite group has a responsibility. Montesquieu says separate that power amongst the elite group. Don't let the elite group get all the power. Hobbes says you give all the power to one elite individual. Rousseau says the government's just there to reflect what the people want, and that the government should reflect the general will of the population. And in a lot of ways, this lays the foundation for mass democracy. You can connect this to socialism, to communism. There's going to be a lot of 19th and 20th and 21st century political movements that are rooted here in Rousseau's ideas. But we're going to be talking about that more in the next lecture. So those are the political aspects. And what I would encourage you to do is know each of these four individuals and what they believed in. Okay. And when we look at the economic aspects, the tradition that's being challenged is mercantilism and the guild system. So if you remember mercantilism, the government makes rules because it's a competition for wealth. Wealth cannot be created. There's only a fixed amount of wealth in the world. And your job is to go out and get that wealth. So mercantilism, the big thing I want you to remember in the context of this lecture, mercantilism regulates trade. and always make sure that the regulations of trade favor the nation's interest. So mercantilism restricts and regulates trade. The guild system deals more with workers who come together to control prices and to control membership. So you don't want to quite call it a union, and there's a lot of differences, but you have the right idea. So a guild controls the membership, who can do the job, and the guild also controls the prices. They keep prices elevated for the benefit of everybody in the guild. So they eliminate or they limit competition and they keep prices up. So this is the old system. This is the medieval system. This is the absolutist system. This is how things were going. But what Adam Smith brings in is what we call free market economics. And this is going to be a little tricky to understand, but at the same time, this is the basis for capitalism. This is the capitalist theory. So what Adam Smith believed was that you wanted to let people act in their self-interest. So let people use their resources, let people use their talents to better themselves and give them the freedom to do so. But by letting them do what's in their best interest, they actually end up benefiting society as if guided by an invisible hand. So, what Adam Smith was saying is that by letting people act in their self interest, they actually benefit the greater good better than any plan ever could. So, let's put it another way. You're out there, you're watching this lecture, you're young, you're 15, 16 years old, and you're in the process of trying to figure out what you want to do with your life. What Adam Smith would say is you figure it out for yourself. You pursue what you're best interested in. And if that, for example, I'll use a doctor. If becoming a doctor is what you really want to do and you pursue that and you achieve that, one, you'll be motivated to do it. Nobody will need to motivate you because the motivation comes from within. You're doing it because you want to do it, and that gives you a drive. Second thing it ends up doing is that because you're the one doing it and you're the one committed to it, you are going to be the best doctor you could possibly be. And then the third part of that is that since you are the best doctor you could possibly be, all of society benefits because now we have a good doctor. So even though you are always acting in your own interests, you end up helping the whole society as if guided by an invisible hand. And the invisible hand is a perfect metaphor for natural law. It's a perfect metaphor for how natural law works. So, to Adam Smith, the role of the government is to enforce contracts, but otherwise to stay out of the way and allow people to pursue their own interests. I really do want to emphasize this role of government, protecting contracts and protecting property, making sure that the property rights of a human being is protected and enforced. That's the role of government, according to Adam Smith. Now, sometimes the government will have to do things that nobody would want to do on their own. For example, providing a national defense. Nobody wants to pay the money to raise an army. That's something the government can do. But otherwise, the government should stay out of people's way. And that's what brings us to letter C, laissez faire. Laissez faire is the economic theory that the government should stay uninvolved, should not regulate the economy, should not put in rules and restrictions. Laissez faire is a rejection of mercantilism. Mercantilism gives monopolies to companies. The government goes, here you go, East India Company, you have a monopoly. In Adam Smith's world, it's all about competition because the company that is better is going to be better for everyone. And if you have competition between businesses, they will work hard to produce a better product at a lower cost for the consumer. And who does that end up benefiting ultimately? The consumer. So Adam Smith's theories are fundamental to how we run our economy today. We talk about a market based economy, and that has its roots in Adam Smith. That's capitalism. So we're going to shift from the economics to the religion. So in this case, the tradition that's being challenged is Christianity, but mainly the Catholic Church. And this idea of what we might call dogma thinking, dogmatic thinking. So the idea is that the church says it is so, everybody accepts it. The Enlightenment philosophers are against this type of mentality, where just because the church says it, it is so, to the Enlightenment philosophers is simply unacceptable. And there's a philosopher who comes along named Voltaire. He's like the philosopher's philosopher. He's the ultimate philosopher of the Enlightenment. And Voltaire famously said, crush the infamous thing. That phrase, crush the infamous thing, is a reference to superstition, is a reference to dogmatic thinking that Voltaire felt was holding human beings back. Kind of that rigid, non compromising, inside the box thinking of, well, because it has been told to me this way, it must be so. That's something Voltaire saw as the infamous thing. He saw that as what was holding human beings back. So Voltaire believed that education would open the eyes of human beings and we would become enlightened. We would become more enlightened and we would start to realize the greater truths of the world. So this mentality, kind of looking at the Catholic clergy, which is something Voltaire did and looked down upon them. Voltaire was highly critical of the Catholic clergy as peddling superstitious and magical thinking. A new religious expression is going to develop called deism. And deism is the belief that there was a God, the God created the universe, and then the God set up the rules of the universe, and now the universe just operates on its own. And with deism, an easier way to remember that is the watchmaker philosophy. So, presumably, somebody created a watch. Okay. Let's say I'm walking along a beach and I find a watch in the sand. I don't assume the watch just magically appeared in the sand. I make the assumption that somebody dropped the watch. And then I can also assume that somebody invented the watch, somebody created the watch, and they put the gears and they put the clockworks, if you will, into the machine. But then the watch runs itself afterwards. That's how deism sees the world. God is the watchmaker, the world is the watch. The world does not need God to constantly be tinkering with it. God's done his job according to deism. God has stepped back and now the machine runs itself. So deism combines that enlightenment approach with the belief in a God. Okay. But here's the most important thing about the religious aspects is this push for religious tolerance. This now you have to remember that Europe is coming out of the religious wars where Protestants and Catholics were at each other's throats. What the philosophers are saying is that it is absurd to think that any one person knows the absolute truth. And so, what Voltaire and other philosophers are going to preach is religious tolerance. The idea that you can have a variety of understandings of God and that a society can't be so single minded. It has to allow for a tolerance of different religions or what we call pluralism. So, pluralism is that idea that multiple ideas, multiple belief systems can coexist in one society. And again, if you think about the United States, you can drive up and down Route 27 off Ridge Road and find churches of all different varieties. You can see Catholic churches and Baptist churches and Methodist churches, and then you can find synagogues, you can find mosques, you can find Hindu temples, all within the same society. And the idea is that it's reinforced through this pluralistic idea. We nobody has all the answers, and therefore we can all coexist. That's what Voltaire and the other philosophers are arguing. Our next thing is the views on human condition. So this gets a little heady. So the traditional idea is this rigid social hierarchy, which we've talked about in the past, that people belong in a different segment of society. and that some people were by nature higher than other people. And we can go through all the different societies and justify this in different ways. What happens is that the human condition argument that these different philosophers are going to present all point to the same thing, that by nature, human beings are equal, that the natural condition of human beings is equality. And what society has created is inequality. So if we take one look, which is the negative look, the dim look, human beings are competitive and selfish. This is what Hobbes and Montesquieu argue. And because they're competitive and selfish, they're equally competitive, they're equally selfish. All human beings have this. It's not just one class or another class. All human beings are naturally competitive and naturally selfish, according to Hobbes and Montesquieu. So they say because of that condition, here's what you do. Hobbes says you put in a strong government to control these people. Montesquieu says you take the power and you break it up, and everybody has a piece of that power. And that way you keep a tyrant from forming. So it's interesting. Hobbes says you need to have a strong authoritarian government to control the people. Montesquieu says you need to take the power and break it up so that we never get that authoritarian figure who will abuse the power. So even though they both have the same view of human condition, they have two different prescriptions of what to do. And I think that's just something to keep in mind. John Locke puts out this blank slate idea. And I would argue that there has been no other idea in the past 300 years that have had more of a profound impact than the blank slate. Or if you take psychology, the tabula rasa idea. Call it the blank slate if you didn't understand the Latin I just said. So, what John Locke said is human beings come out of the womb, they come into existence neutral. We're a blank slate. We are a chalkboard with no writing on it whatsoever. We're just blank. And then over time, experiences shape who we become. Now, in psychology, we call this the nature versus nurture debate. Um, are we who we are? Am I who I am by virtue of the environment I grew up in? Or because there's something within my genetic code that was going to make me into who I am, regardless of what environment I would be in? And this is the great question. And of course, us being good human beings, we go, it's a little bit of both. We don't actually take a position. But Locke took a very strong position. He said, experience makes the person, which leads us to the next idea. If I change the environment, if I change the experience, then I can change the person. So the idea is that if I'm a young athlete, okay, and I join a sport, if I put that athlete in an environment of very competitive players, that athlete will become a better athlete. Versus if I put that athlete with a bunch of poor players, the environment impacts the development of that person. So that's John Locke. And you can see the ramification that it has, in terms of how we conduct policy today. And then you have the noble savage argument, which is Jean Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau said that man was by nature good. Man was by nature free, but here it comes. Society corrupts man. So man is by nature, when they come into the world, they're good, they're free, they are as they are naturally meant to be. But society begins to enchain them. Society begins to create limits on those freedoms. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. And I guess the best idea to kind of show this is how children like to laugh. Adults do not laugh out loud the way children laugh out loud. And what Rousseau would say is that man's natural condition is to enjoy and laugh and participate in fun activity. And that's what children do. But society teaches us, for whatever reason, that that is something we shouldn't be doing. So society teaches us something that goes against our nature. And as a consequence, we become grumpy old people. That's your destiny. Just letting you all know. So this idea, Rousseau would celebrate the child and say the child's got it. The old people, the adults, they don't understand. They've lost their connection to the natural way of being. But you can also see where this might connect to such arguments today about the role institutional or systematic discrimination plays. And when you listen to those arguments about institutional racism, institutional discrimination, you can connect this back to Rousseau. You can see where Rousseau is saying that human beings are confined by the rules of society, whereas John Locke would say they're not confined by anything except for the environment they're around. And Hobbes and Montesquieu would, of course, say they're selfish and competitive. You've got to put restrictions on this. So it's interesting that we have three different mindsets about the conditions of human beings, and that leads to a multitude of ways of understanding how society should be organized. Our last one is the views on women. And of course, the tradition of the patriarchy, the idea of male supremacy, is going to be attacked here by some of the Enlightenment. Some of the Enlightenment is going to reinforce it. So we have this idea of the patriarchy, which we've seen in different societies throughout our course of study. This idea that males hold a higher level in society than females. And the political and economic structure of society favors men. That's basically your patriarchy in a nutshell. In the late 1700s, a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft will come along, and she will write a series of works that will put forth the argument that men and women are inherently and by nature equal. She said there's only one thing that men are superior than women in, and that is in physical strength. So Mary Wollstonecraft said, look, men are physically stronger on average than women. And she said, but that's it. She said, when it comes to the mind, when it comes to the ability to think, men, there's no difference between the male mind and the female mind. To her, there is no male mind, no female mind. There is just the mind. And then, and this is where we can see her connection to today, cultural messages teach women to be second class citizens. So, what Wollstonecraft says is that women are by nature equal to men. She is very much along the John Locke thinking, the blank slate. And to her, women come into the world with a blank slate. But the environment starts to send these messages to women that they are lesser than men. And so what she does is she argues that the issue isn't that men hate women or that men are by nature evil, is that we in society have set up these messages that get transferred from generation to generation to generation, that women are by nature one way and men are by nature another way. And she's arguing that that's all just the environment. That has nothing to do with the actual natural condition of men and women in terms of the mind. So, what she argued was for political and economic freedom for women, that women should be political equals to men. They should be participating in society on the same level as men. And more importantly, women should have economic freedom. And she goes, this is a little bit of Adam Smith. What if a woman could become a really good doctor that benefits society? It's not just good for the woman, but it's good for all of us that we have another good doctor. So instead of teaching women that they're incapable of taking care of themselves, Mary Wollstonecraft would argue, give them access to education so that they can provide for themselves and, as a result, benefit all of us. So, in a lot of ways, Wollstonecraft is the beginnings of modern feminism. There's a lot in Mary Wollstonecraft that we can connect to feminism today, especially number two, the way messages and culture and society influence the way we understand how women are to behave and how men are to behave. On the flip side of all of this is the separate spheres argument, and that comes from Jean Jacques Rousseau. We're going to bring this guy back up. And what Jean Jacques Rousseau said was that women and men occupy separate spheres. Men are naturally designed to do governing and to do trade and to provide protection. And women are naturally designed to be nurturers, to take care of the family, to take care of the home. That's the definition of separate spheres. And the idea is that he uses natural laws to justify this. Basically, Rousseau says nature created women to take care and nurture society. Nature created men to run and protect society. And it's interesting that you get from Wollstonecraft and Rousseau two different completely ideas about the role of women within society. And yet they both argue that nature proves them right. And when we think about this, I say Wollstonecraft is the foundation of modern feminism. We can look at Rousseau's separate spheres and see that as a foundation of the modern patriarchy. So it's interesting from this Enlightenment, you get two completely different views. So with that, I conclude this lecture. The big thing is that with the Enlightenment, the first slide is probably the most important thing for AP World History. But the names Rousseau, Wollstonecraft, Montesquieu, Hobbes, Locke, and Smith, in my estimation, are six names you should know. Not necessarily for world history, though you will need to know it for the quiz, for the lecture questions, but for your own education and for your own understanding of how we got to where we are today. So I conclude that. As always, bring your questions to class, and I look forward to seeing you again. Bye.